Today I'm going to be talking about the early launch anti-malware system, also known as ELAM. This is Microsoft's anti-tampering mechanism that they offer to, well, not only themselves, like in Defender for Endpoint, Defender AV, but also like any third-party endpoint vendors can opt into this security feature. All right, so a brief introduction into ELAM and PPL, Protected Process Light processes. But before I get started, I just want to give credit where credit is due. Even like any work that is novel, it's derivative in some way, and so this is no exception. So I just want to give a shout out to James Forshaw and Alex Ionescu. This work wouldn't have been possible without all of the previous work that they did, especially this talk that they gave at Recon in 2018. So I recommend you check it out, and if you ever run into them, thank them for all of their awesome research. So, protected processes. I could have a dedicated talk just to this. Alex and James have done talks on this as well, so I'm not going to get super into the weeds here. So I just like to offer a very high-level description of the protected process mechanisms and how they apply to the ELAM ecosystem. So a PPL process, the protections that they afford is it's designed to prevent tampering in user mode. So emphasis on that. All of this work is scoped to attacking everything in user mode. All of these anti-tampering mechanisms, like if you could abuse a signed driver, you can bypass all these things anyway, but we're just going to keep things scoped again to user mode. And it's designed to prevent admin tampering as well, even things running as system. So you can't start or stop a protected process. More specifically, it's harder to stop than it is to start a protected process. You can't get a handle to a protected process. You can't attach a debugger. They're really hard to actually troubleshoot if you don't have all the right signers in place to troubleshoot and debug these things in a legitimate scenario. And in order to run protected at the anti-malware-light level, which is what we're going to be talking about here today, the executable must meet very specific signing requirements. And we'll get into very explicit detail about what those signing requirements are and how we can possibly take advantage of them. So in order to opt in to running as a PPL anti-malware-light process, again, this is what all third-party vendors, but also first-party Microsoft products get to opt into. You need an ELAM driver. So in this driver, you don't actually have to implement any code. Now there are like early launch hooks that you could implement in that driver if you wanted to do some like signature checking very early in the boot process. But the only thing that you really need in this driver is a binary resource that specifies which signers are allowed to run as anti-malware-light services. And in order to be approved to be co-signed by Microsoft as an ELAM driver, you have to submit your driver to Microsoft and also be a member of their rather exclusive Microsoft Virus Initiative program. So I'll talk a little bit about how I went about doing initial recon and just discovering like what was available so that I could better understand how ELAM drivers are structured, what the rules in them actually mean when it comes to the signers that are allowed to run as a protected service. So what you're seeing here is this is the traditional way that an ELAM driver is supposed to be registered. We're looking at WD boot. This is the Microsoft Defender AV ELAM driver. This will be installed by default on any Windows system. They're supposed to be installed as a service in the early launch service group. So this WMI query would just list all of those out. Now, I said this is the default way of installing it. As we'll see later on, you don't actually have to install the ELAM driver in this way. You can just call an API to get it registered. So in the rule sets in the ELAM driver, in that binary resource, there is a list of signer hashes. And those signer hashes correspond to the certificates that are allowed to start a service protected at the anti-malware-light level. Now, these aren't the typical certificate hashes that you may be accustomed to, specifically thumbprints, which is the SHA-1 hash of the certificate. Rather, these are TBS, or to-be-signed hashes. Those of you who may be familiar with Windows Defender application control, you may have seen these quite a bit. It's just a slightly different hashing algorithm. I don't know the mechanics behind it, but it's based on the hashing algorithm that's specified in the certificate. So it's just a slightly different representation of the hash. Now, unfortunately, what made some of this research a little bit more challenging is that VirusTotal doesn't understand TBS hashes. It understands thumbprints, so you can search for binaries based on thumbprint, which is great. But if you're auditing these drivers and pulling out all the rules, you may not necessarily be able to go easily identify what the corresponding executables would be that could run protected. There are two utilities I'm aware of that will calculate and present to you these TBS hashes. In the Windows SDK, there's Cert Manager, so supplied by Microsoft. I also wrote a PowerShell script that's publicly available called getTBSHash. So this is the structure that the signer rules are expected to be represented as in that binary resource in the ELAM driver. So it's the certificate hash, and then the hash algorithm, which is specific to TBS hash. As I mentioned, you have to have the corresponding certificate hashing algorithm for the actual hash. And then optionally, any EKUs. These are enhanced key usage attributes. So these are just special attributes that you can apply to the certificate to specify that a certificate is used for a very particular purpose. So let's look at an example of what these rules would look like in the wild. So after parsing out the rule set in wdboot, this is Microsoft's Defender driver, there are two rules in it. So you see there are two TBS hashes in there. Try to remember that F6F1 will be referencing that later. It uses the SHA-256 hashing algorithm, and it also specifies two EKUs. So the way that you would interpret this is any code, like any executable, like an EXE or a DLL, could be loaded as a protected service at the anti-malware-light level if it has any of those certificate hashes anywhere in the chain. So a typical certificate chain will be comprised of three certificates. There's a root certificate, an intermediate certificate, and a leaf certificate. The leaf certificate is what signs the code. But this says if any of those are anywhere in the certificate chain, then it's allowed to run. With one caveat, the leaf certificate in this case must have both of those EKUs present in the binary when it's signed. So let's look at one such binary that is signed and meets all of those prerequisites. So we are looking at, let me skip ahead one. This is mpeng.exe. This is the main Defender AV malware engine executable. So I'm using the built-in get system driver commandlet, which I can use to extract the thumbprint. You can do this through the GUI as well. I'm a PowerShell fanboy, so I just do everything through there. And so just note the thumbprint value, the F25. This is the SHA-1 hash of the certificate and the corresponding TBS hash. So I said, remember the F6F TBS hash. So I'm showing you here, like this executable, msmpeng.exe, has that certificate hash somewhere in its chain. And just note its corresponding thumbprint. It's the same hash, just different hashing algorithms, okay? But there are two different hashes for the same certificate, I mean. And this is what it looks like in the GUI, but what I wanted to highlight here was for MSMPENG, when we look at the signer attributes, I've pulled up the EKU, the enhanced key usages, and you'll see it's the first two ones listed. the ones that end in 76.11.1 and 76.8.1 that match those two specified EKUs. So we have the certificate hash that's somewhere in the chain, and we have those EKUs applied, and it's a valid certificate. So that means that msnp-eng.exe is allowed to run as a protected anti-malware-light service. Okay? So let's do some further validation. Let's actually confirm that this process is running at the anti-malware protected light level. So this was a tool I wrote. Johnny Johnson here also on our team wrote a similar tool parsing this out. So you can get this information via NT query information process, I think. So this is just useful for troubleshooting. So you can indeed see that it's running protected. And then I'm using WMI to identify the corresponding service for that running process, the WinDefend service. Because remember I mentioned you have to install this as a service in order to get it to run at the protected level. And here's the corresponding service registration for WinDefend. And what is noteworthy is the launch protected value is set to 3, which corresponds to the PS protected signer anti-malware level. So Windows, when the service manager goes to start this service, it sees that launch protected value. It says, okay, I need to start this up as an anti-malware-light service. So it goes back and it validates all the signatures, the certificate hashes. If it checks all those boxes, then it will indeed run at the anti-malware-light level and be afforded all of the anti-tampering protections given to you by ELAM and PPL. Okay, so as I was researching this, the question that naturally arose for me was, given that ELAM is like an allow list for anti-malware PPL process execution, does there exist an ELAM driver that might be overly permissive and maybe allowing more than it should? So let's investigate that. So this was my initial research process. I've got a Virus Total Intelligence account, which is really nice because I can do a query like this. So this query specifies, this is the signer subject name for ELAM certificates. So when you submit your driver to Microsoft, they return it back to you, approve it, and co-sign it with their certificate. That is the subject name of that driver. Tag native searches just for device drivers. I'm looking for things that are signed and that are executables or just like PE files. And then filter out anything that has an invalid signature. And this yielded 886 unique results. I did some additional validation just to whittle things down and make sure that I was working with ELAM drivers that actually had that binary resource. It's called the MS ELAM cert info ID resource. Made sure I could parse those out and just double check to make sure that every ELAM driver that I pulled down in bulk had a valid certificate. And then just en masse, I parsed out every single rule for all 766 drivers that I identified and pulled down in bulk. Apologies if you can't see this clearly in the back. This is just kind of for reference and to give you a sense of the scope of how many vendors have ELAM drivers out there. So there are the typical players, which you probably see most of these vendors over in the vendor hall. Some of them definitely stood out to me. So like there's that one blank bullet that wasn't a typo. There were some ELAM drivers that didn't have a vendor assigned to it. Kind of interesting. Also in the center column, kind of like in the center up a little bit, there's a vendor name of to-do company name, Windows, Win7, DDK, just some kind of like oddball vendors that, I don't know, just seemed odd, but all I could really go off was just kind of a gut feel. But this was kind of like potential further validation that maybe there exists at least one rule set that might be overly permissive, whether that was intentional or not. All right, so the ELAM auditing strategy, once I pulled down, unmasked those 766 ELAM drivers, is to go about the difficult process of taking the TBS hashes, which I parsed out from the ELAM drivers, and identifying the corresponding TBS, or sorry, the corresponding thumbprint value. This was pretty challenging. I couldn't always do that. I had to resort to Googling for some of these, but most of these hashes just aren't on the internet. So I had to resort to more creative strategies for identifying the thumbprint value so that I could actually search for some candidate abusable binaries in VirusTotal. And the idea was, like, if there was a hypothetical overly permissive rule set, are there any like potential law bins that would permit arbitrary unsigned code execution that matched one of those overly permissive rules, which would then allow me to install it as a protected service and potentially get arbitrary code execution in the context of a protected process. So remember I said, remember that F6F hash? That was the Microsoft intermediate hash. So here I'm just going through some more of the recon process. So I was literally going through the hundreds of hashes that I parsed out and just Googling all of them to see if I could find any hope of finding a corresponding thumbprint value. I got lucky in this case. Should be no surprise. Like it's a Microsoft intermediate cert, fairly common. So I got a few hits. Fortunately for this, there was one great website. Someone was trying to troubleshoot some signer issues, and right there in the website is the TBS hash right next to the thumbprint. So great, I had something that I could easily search for, again, that thumbprint hash. So I'll take that thumbprint hash and then search for that in VirusTotal using the signature tag. And I got something like this, so 171,000 results. No big surprise, because that was a Microsoft intermediate certificate. You would expect, there's a lot of Microsoft signed code that uses that intermediate certificate out there. And there's no way in VirusTotal to search for binaries without maybe doing some fancy Yara hunting that have those EKU values. So that was a challenge right there. But I didn't really want to focus my research per se on those restrictive EKUs, because I just kind of had a sense that there weren't going to be many abusable binaries that match these rules, that have the Microsoft publisher and anti-malware EKUs applied to them. I'm not saying that they don't exist. I just think it's probably unlikely that they do. There's probably there's bigger fish to fry out there that's just going to be easier to find. And so here's the results of the quick research that I did. This slide is really important. Pay attention to it. So I'll walk you through how to interpret this. Of all the 766 ELAM drivers that I identified and parsed out all the TBS hashes for all the rule sets and found corresponding thumbprints, these are ones that, these are rules that were present in those binaries. So that first Microsoft Corporation hash value, mind you, it didn't have an EKU restriction on it. So this means that if you have any Microsoft signed executable that has that certificate anywhere in the chain, then it can run protected. Same for the second. And then what was even worse was the third-party intermediate certificates. So if you have any certificate that was issued by any of those three certificate authorities, then you can run your code, your malware, whatever, as at the anti-malware-light protected level. So the one we'll focus on is 495. Let me go back one. Okay, that's the VeriSign intermediate certificate. Okay, so we have the corresponding thumbprint for the VeriSign intermediate certificate. I wanted to know what code is signed any code signed by that, so this is going to be the intermediate certificate, so the leaf certificate will be different, but that's okay. It's going to be allowed to run, and show me any executables that have 40 or more positive AV hits. So in other words, like confirmed malware that would be allowed to run at the anti-malware-light level. So we have 177,000 unique samples of malware that can be afforded all of the protections of anti-malware PPL. So kind of hard to kill those things once they get started at that level. Now, this relies on my ability, your ability, to identify what those ELAM drivers are. So if you have VTI access, then maybe this is something that you could investigate a little bit further. I'm not going to be calling out any vendor names here, so it could be an exercise for later. Okay, so how would you actually weaponize this? So you'll want to identify a candidate abusable executable. Note the thumbprint value here, that's 620. That corresponds to the second Microsoft certificate there, okay? And the first lol bin that came to mind for me was MS Build. Should be easy enough to abuse. It's like one of the most classic lol bins that can get you arbitrary unsigned code execution. Thank you, Casey Smith, for that. And so I found 16 unique hits for that were signed with that very specific ELAM rule set. Okay, so what do you do with that? Once you identify that candidate MS Build, I would like to get arbitrary unsigned code execution from that. What you do is you take the ELAM driver that you identified was overly permissive and had that Microsoft rule in it, and you drop it to the host. It's signed, like it's legitimate, it's fine, and you call the install ELAM certificate info API. You have to do this as admin. You would have to be elevated anyway to install the service. And then you would drop your candidate binary that you want to abuse, in this case MS Build, and then calling change service config 2W, or you can just do this directly in the registry. You're going to specify that the service needs to run at the anti-malware-light level. Start the service, and then profit, maybe. Now, there's still additional steps, like in order to get arbitrary unsigned code execution from MS Build, you have to give it an XML file, which consists of like C# code, and hope that you can actually get that to run. Turns out there's some constraints, though. What are those? So probably all lol bins out there were not designed for the express purpose of running in the context of a protected process. And by the nature of the anti-malware-light protection level being pretty robust and not allowing a lot of dangerous things to occur, one thing that can't happen by default is a malware running at the protected level cannot spawn a child process by default. So like if you just call the create process API from the context of the protected process, it's going to fail. You have to supply like a specific flag to create process to actually allow that. But these lol bins, like they're not going to be supplying that flag. And when you execute code and like abuse MS Build, part of the artifacts of that is there's a child process. It calls like the C# compiler, assuming you're supplying C# code to execute. So it spawns that process. So that wasn't allowed. So this broke for me when I was trying to weaponize it. Like I confirmed that it started, the service started protected, but I couldn't get it to execute code. So I had to get a little creative. And again, thank you, Casey Smith, for blogging way back when about property functions in MS Build. So this was kind of a neat little hack that I was able to use to get around not having MS Build not spawn a child process. So this is what the weaponized payload for MS Build actually looks like. It's a super weird syntax. It's kind of like PowerShell, and it has to be in a one-liner. So I had to get kind of creative, like how to weaponize this. So what I ultimately wanted to do to demonstrate arbitrary unsigned code execution was get this to load in memory and execute a .NET assembly. So that's what the highlighted code does here. You would just take your malicious .NET assembly, excuse me, and you would implement the logic that you want to execute in the test constructor. And then in that, and then you take that whole binary, base64, encode it, and then you just drop the base64 code string in there, and then MS Build will run your payload without issue. So thanks again, Casey. OK, so quick demo. OK, what we're going to be seeing here is, first, we're going to list out all the protected processes. And note the ones that are running at the anti-malware-light level. So we have two here, MSMP-ENG, that's the Defender AV engine, and NAS SRV. Now I'm going to run my code that runs arbitrary PowerShell using MS Build. And you can see that MS Build is indeed running at the anti-malware-light level. This code is out there. It's publicly available. I'll link to it at the end. OK, so this is just a rather benign payload. I was just having it like run a sleep command just to show and prove that MS Build was indeed running at that protected level. So another payload that we could do, so once you're running at the protected level, not only is your own malware protected by processes that aren't protected, but you can now go kill other protected processes. So let's see what that looks like. Again, we'll list out the protected processes. We're going to pick on MSMP-ENG. Note the process ID 3168. And I'm running elevated here, and I'm just going to try to stop it using stop process. Doesn't allow it. No surprise there. But using invoke anti-malware-light command, by abusing that overly permissive driver, we're going to kill the process through MS Build running protected. And now note that MSMP-ENG has a new process ID. So what happened there was the old one was killed, and Defender AV, it restarts itself. Then gets a new one. And then we'll just try it again for giggles and see what happens. So now it just failed to restart again, and then you can hopefully see on the bottom right, the Defender little icon went from green to red, indicating that something happened. So we've effectively killed the Defender AV engine through MS Build running at the protected level because we abused an ELAM driver that has an overly permissive rule set. In this case, it's overly permissive elam.sys. I had to rename it to protect innocent vendors. So yeah, that's what's necessary to abuse that. So how might we go about mitigating and trying to detect this stuff? So fortunately, WDAC, for the few people out there who might employ this, so again, this is Windows Defender application control. It can block these from loading. So if you want to be very specific about the ELAM drivers that you want to allow in your environment, it's generally a good thing to do. Not sure how well that would scale, but the technology does allow you to block ELAM drivers that shouldn't be allowed in your environment. And then hopefully we might be able to get a more robust fix from Microsoft in the future. But as you can maybe understand, like this is abusing the features of the ELAM allow rule set rather than abusing any sort of vulnerability and abusing the submission process to Microsoft, that Microsoft even allowed these overly permissive rules to be put in place in the first place. Now, I can't even begin to speculate why any of those like third-party intermediate certificates would ever be allowed. So shame on Microsoft for that. The Microsoft rule sets, my only speculation as to why those might be in there is because imagine if an endpoint security vendor took a dependency on like the Visual C runtime library. Like, that's signed by Microsoft. And they're like, well, we take a dependency on this, so we need to be able to get our DLL to load into our protected service. And so Microsoft, like, please allow this. And sure enough, they allowed that. That's still speculation, but I think that's a reasonable explanation for why some of those vendors had those Microsoft certificates in there. And we also audited like a bunch of other vendors, and one thing that we wanted to try to do was for the rule sets that were particular to a vendor, I'm not picking on like VMware here, it's just the first vendor that comes to mind, like they have their own ELAM driver, and so you can parse their rule set and then identify any of their corresponding VMware signed executables that could, in theory, run protected, and then this whole auditing process would apply equally like to VMware, where we would try to identify like VMware signed lull bins that would protect, or that would permit arbitrary unsigned code execution. In the case of VMware, I wasn't able to find any obvious ones. Same goes for lots of other vendors. So again, I was just going for like the path of least resistance here, like anything that allows Microsoft, because as you saw, I was able to find an abusable MS build, so that got the job done. So some detection recommendations. My advice would be to focus on the registering of any protected services. Of course, you're going to have false positives, but in theory, like if you can suppress some of those, this should be relatively rare that you would have any new services be created that you don't expect in your environment. I would probably shy away from like anti-malware-light process creation. I think that would probably be much more false positive prone. So yeah, I just encourage you to focus on service creation or modification. As for vendors, again, I'm not going to shame any vendors here. I don't even blame the vendors who have the overly permissive rule sets entirely, because Microsoft allowed them to submit and approve those overly permissive rules. But I would encourage any vendor who does publish and have a signed ELAM driver, just to go back and audit your rule set and make sure you're not allowing anything that shouldn't be in there, because you wouldn't want to be the vendor that ruined the entire anti-malware-light ecosystem for everyone. So in conclusion, why is this so bad? One overly permissive ELAM driver from a single vendor poisons the well for all other vendors. Again, so the way that we weaponize this is we identify that overly permissive driver, we drop it onto the system, we register it with that API, and then we take our corresponding service executable that is signed, so MS build, and run that protected. And so even if what's installed on our target system is like, again, like VMware Carbon Black Cloud, right? If the overly permissive ELAM driver is from another vendor, there's nothing preventing me, the attacker, from just dropping that side by side with VMware in this case, registering that, and then getting MS build to run my malicious payload and be protected, or to go stop the VMware Carbon Black Cloud endpoint service as well. So again, the Microsoft's vetting process for these things is far from robust, and hopefully in the future, they may gradually implement some stronger checks and start to lock this down. But there is no easy fix right now. So I reported this to Microsoft back in December of 2021. They acknowledged the issue. No surprise, like I'm not bashing on MSRC. This is not a security boundary. But I pass it on to the Defender research team, and they owned this. Like, so I just want to thank David Kaplan, Gil Besso, Phil Sukerman on the Defender research team. They've just been wonderful to work with. They've taken it very seriously, and they have proactively communicated with their Microsoft Virus Initiative partners. So anyone who does have an ELAM certificate or ELAM driver through the MVI program, you would have already been reached out to and proactively communicated with. So again, shout out to them. They've just been awesome. Microsoft gave me an official response saying we've got a tight partnership here, and that indeed they did communicate with their MVI partners. So they've been great. Okay, so some resources if you want to learn more about ELAM, protected processes. These slides will be available soon, so I recommend you check these out if you want to learn more. And then the code that you saw me use, all of this is available on my GitHub. So get ELAM cert info, you just point it to an ELAM driver and it will parse out those rules for you. Get TBS hash, again, that's the one that will take a certificate and calculate the TBS hash so that you can start to go through that research process. And then finally, the partially weaponized script. It's a PowerShell module called antimalware-light. I intentionally wanted it to be defanged, so it is fully weaponized if you bring your own abusable ELAM driver and abusable MS build that you can go find on VirusTotal. Okay? So thank you.